I'm going to talk about design, and I'm going to talk about a topic that is a bit unusual for designers, at least. And I'm trying to give a bit of moderation. So my name is Hartmut. I'm working with Canonical. Canonical builds Ubuntu, but Canonical also builds lots of tools that people use to build clouds. And that's one of my first experiences when joining Canonical was that people were showing user experience on big screens, and none of them had any graphics on it. So all of it was textual terminals. And that triggered me to basically say this is something that we have to also take a look at as design, because no designer was involved in creating those. And I would like to focus today on one specific aspect of designing CLIs, and that is information architecture or conceptual architecture. So this is just a preview. I'll get there eventually. So I first want to start with you maybe having a little bit of a read here. This is what is a CLI and what is design, in case you haven't encountered either of them. One is from Wikipedia, the other one is from a non-designer who founded a fairly successful company. And I think the important takeaway for me here is that CLIs often seem to be like an old thing nowadays, but they were actually invented as something that improved upon the user interface. So before CLIs, there were punch cards, and it was really hard to actually give a command to a machine and then see what that machine would do when you gave it the command. And that really dramatically changed with CLIs. And if they were not a good solution, they would have gone away. And they haven't. So there's still lots of CLI out there. And I think that is reason enough to ask what are the things that CLIs can do better than other user interfaces. So first, from a designer perspective, CLIs clearly are very different. They're nothing that you have seen before. And one of the reasons is they do not have what you usually expect. They don't have a UI. So you can't use your tools that you are used to. So in open source, I should probably say you can't do this in PenPod. So you can't use the tools that as a designer you would like to use to do your work. That is quite a problem at first. And then they're used only by experts, and there's maybe a feeling that these people know so much more about what they're doing than you that it's very hard to design for them. And then the third thing, which I think is really interesting, is that when you think about what is the difference between a GUI and a CLI, in a GUI what you see is basically the state. So the state is always in front of you, and it's sometimes hard to put in action or to place the actions in the right places. And with a CLI, you do not see the state, because there is no state. There is nothing until you start interacting, and you interact with a command. You actually start with the action, and then maybe as a result of that action, you get to see a little bit of state. But that's only in that moment. So it is a very different paradigm from that perspective, and you have to take care of knowing what happens on the user side and when they are actually interested in that state. So that is one thing that is definitely different, designing for CLIs. But there's also a lot of things that are very similar, and that when designers decide to start interacting with CLIs, they find this is actually something I know, and that can be very useful for designing CLIs. So one is accessibility, knowing when to build in accessibility. That is something that a lot of designers are interested in, and with CLIs it's really easy, because it's very, like, the text gives itself very easily to being output in different formats. And also you only have to add a few hints to actually get a quality that's very hard to achieve with a graphical user interface. Visual hierarchy is something that is very powerful, but also in a sense quite limited. So it's important where to put things. It's important where to put the loudness in what you put out. But it's very similar to when you design a web page. It's just sometimes the rules are different, because in a CLI, the last bit that you say is the most important, whereas on a web page, it would probably be the topmost bit that you say. So still, visual hierarchy is very important. Colors are very important, but very difficult or very limited again. There's kind of 16 standard colors. Sometimes you can use more. You can never be sure they are actually there. So what you can't do is you cannot rely on color to convey a message, but you can rely on color to strengthen your message if it's there. Iconography is also interesting because, yes, you can definitely use it, and you should, but you will not be able to design your own. So when you're using icons, you will be using someone else's icons, and you don't exactly know how they will be looking. And then there's copy, which might be obvious, but it's something that is very, very powerful in GUI design, and I think it's even more powerful in CLI design, because the whole attention is kind of focused on the copy. So when you change the copy, you really change the experience, and that makes that a very powerful tool. And then I'll skip over information architecture here. Then there's flows. So when you think of how the interaction is guided, then you can design views, you can design states, and you can design feedback in CLIs. And that is something that you already know from GUIs. You just have to rethink it, because you're not going to be able to give like a permanent perspective of that. You'll be only able to give like when the user asks for what is the status of my list of virtual machines, what is the status of my network, then you'll be able to give them some information. And then there's error handling, which again is pretty similar, but also difficult because the space is so limited. So what we often do not do in CLIs is that when something goes wrong, we give hints on how to resolve the problem. And that can be extremely helpful, especially if you are building a tool that is used seldomly, or like not on a daily or hourly basis, or that can have very specific conditions that do not appear very often. And in those cases, it can be very helpful to, if there's an error, also deliver hints on how to further analyze that error or to resolve that error. And that is something that we also know from designing GUIs, and it is, I think, definitely going to improve CLIs if we do that more. But today, as I said, I would like to look at one specific example in this information architecture, and I'll try to argue for something that's called conceptual architecture here. So I'll do a preamble with a quote from a software developer here. So I think good experiences are universal. The criteria for that are universal. So it's worth looking at what we did for GUIs when we want to know what we can do for CLIs. And with GUIs, we have developed ways of dealing with lots of information. They're not necessarily always great solutions, but they definitely are standard solutions. So menu systems have been in existence for a very long time, and they have been standardized, and people generally know how to deal with them. They exist since long before the web. When the web came, we, of course, also implemented menus in the web. And I don't know if that always makes things better, because these menu systems can be extremely, let's say, huge and lose kind of the function that they have, like the structuring of the information. But I think the ambition of creating an information architecture is always to provide a structure so that it's easier to understand what something is about. And that is also the same with CLIs, only that with CLIs, you're dealing with commands. So when you're looking at a CLI, the first thing that you see is what commands does the CLI provide. And these are often an unordered heap or an alphabetical list of these are the verbs, the actions that a command provides. And if you think of architecture here, I think there's two axes that can help you. One is what is the primary purpose of the command. So often a command has one thing that it does for first-time users, or one thing that is most often the used functionality, and that is something that is different from all the rest of the functionality that might be less used or only used in specific special cases. And then a lot of the actions that you can trigger do have some kind of coherent theme to them. So if you're looking at a life cycle of a virtual machine, there's different actions, but they all refer to the life cycle of a virtual machine. If you're looking into signing on or signing off a server, if you want to manage the local cache of something, there's often several actions that are separate, but they share a certain topic. And the way that we aim to visualize that with Canonical is we try to basically show the depth of what is the primary purpose of a command. So this is a snap command, it's kind of a package manager, and of course the primary purpose of a package manager is finding, installing, refreshing, which means like updating, removing, and understanding what actually is there in terms of packages. So that's kind of the very, very basic functionality. And if you want to show the help for the snap command, that's what we want to put first. And then there's a lot of other functionality that the tool provides, and those are organized in topics. So you have something about the history, something about the configuration, something about snapshots, and then you can find out more about those if you want to go in more depth. But it makes sense to have those layers in a CLI. There's the primary purpose, and then there's the feature scope. And together, that creates kind of the shape of a command. And if you can very clearly define that shape, we found that it's a lot easier for people to understand what is this thing trying to do, what is this about. Another thing that I find fascinating as a designer is that designing for CLIs is extremely direct. So you're not thinking too much about metaphors, you're not thinking about how to communicate something. It's really just about what are the objects that you're dealing with, what are the actions that you want to provide, and what is the grammar that you have to put together to enable actions acting on objects. And that is something that is in its reduced scope, something that is, I think, very interesting because it forces you to be very clear on what actually are the objects that we are interacting with. Can we give them names that are extremely clear? What are the actions that we want to allow? And can we also give them names that are extremely clear? So that is something that led us in Canonical to try and create a standard where we say there's different ways where you can put these things together. For Canonical, we decided it makes sense to concentrate on the verbs. So we want commands to be verbs. Every command should be a verb. And then the verbs should communicate what they refer to. So the object should be part of what the verb is saying, at least for the primary purpose of a command. And then if we want to go deeper and if we want to add lots of functionality, then we also go and add a name, an object to the verb. So that's something that is kind of for the more complex commands there. And this is something that we put out as an internal rule, and it helps us, let's say, limit the extent of a command and thus create a clearer shape. And that is what I would say is going a little bit beyond the information architecture. I would also like to talk a little bit about how we try to support designers in actually creating this shape. And we have built an internal tool that I'll be showing. And we've built that internal tool with also knowing that it's very easy nowadays to to create a CLI. So as a developer, of course, you can use a library and then you can build a CLI and it will give you a lot of automatic functionality. But also as a designer, you can go to an LLM and ask it to build a CLI for you, and it will probably build you a CLI. But what we've chosen to do is we wanted to be very precise about what is actually the extent of the command, what is the scope of the command. So we said, let's write the vocabulary in a file and then use that to have a prototype being created. And this is a project that one of my team, Max, has done. So he built all of this as a designer in his free time, as an open source project, of course. It's a prototype that runs in a browser. You can send someone a link and they can try the CLI in a browser in a very artificial environment, which we think is quite useful because it allows for experimentation and for, I would say, for prototyping without having the need to actually build this into a product. So if you do this, you only build a prototype. And it does some very simple things. So you can simulate a lot just with outputting text. So if you have a command, you can say, if someone enters this command, this is the output that will be generated. It looks a little bit like this. And that already is extremely powerful in simulating an environment and its reactions. So you can tell a story with that. We go a little bit beyond that. And we do this because we want to standardize CLIs as well. So we have a design system for GUIs. We also want to have a design system for CLIs. And that means we need standard components. So we build standard components that you can also use as easily as text output, in this case a form. And it works the same way. You just say, I use the standard component form. And then that will be part of your prototype. And we have a very simple implementation of logic, so we can put variables to true or false, and that enables us to, for example, simulate something like what is happening when I'm logging in, what is happening when I'm logged out, what is happening before I started the machine or after I started the machine. And thus, you can tell a bit more complex stories. And that's more or less the extent of it. But we've used this to create prototypes for one of our more complex products, and we're able to test that with external users and got really good feedback, because it was also possible to not just send them one, but 2 or 3 alternatives and ask them about which one do you prefer, why do you prefer that, and have conversations about like the syntax rather than the functionality, let's say. And this is one demo where all of that is put together. So it can get a little bit more complex than what I've shown. Part of it is also because Max wanted to play a bit. So the takeaway for me was like there is definitely worth in designers being part of the process of designing CLIs. I would also say it's not the designer's task alone, because most designers do not live in the context of CLIs. They don't use CLIs on a daily basis, but they can add something to that process. And I think it's also good for designers. So if as a designer you have to work with that reduced scope, with that limited possibilities, that will enable you to think harder about the objects and the actions. And I think that actually makes it easier for you to also create a GUI that will be more clear, more transparent about what it actually tries to achieve. And also for developers, we had really good feedback, like after some initial pushback. So we had really good feedback because we were asking good questions, and we were able to, I would say, enable thinking a little bit outside of what was done before. So this change of perspective help developers also to think differently about their own tools. So what I would like to close with is, if you're interested, the project, as I mentioned, is open source. We are at the moment doing like a beta. If you want to try it out, you can register, and we'll not only be sending you instructions how to use it, we'll also try to ask you a little bit about what you think about it after you tried it. So that's it, and thank you very much for your attention. I think we have a couple of minutes for questions, right?
Yes. Thank you very much for this. It's really cool to see that you can really design the CLI experience, and I see a lot of hands in the air. So let's ask some questions.
Thank you for the talk. Could this tool also be used to kind of advocate for kind of like streamlining linguistics and semantics? Like, for example, verbs like refresh, update, upgrade could all do the same thing, even though the words have different meanings that overlap a little bit, or like delete, remove, uninstall, purge could all kind of like do similar things, and maybe to standardize what they mean, because I'm always confused and I use these words a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we also saw the same problem in looking just at our internal tools. So we have lots of confusion in our tools alone. And we can do the standardization internally in Canonical, because it's not through this tool. What we do is we basically created like a list of words that we want to use and the meaning, and then teams can decide, do I really have exactly this thing here, and then I should be using this word. What makes it a little bit more complex is it's our ambition to have coherence inside the groups. So if we have this concept of you have verbs and they form topics, and then other verbs form another topic, if you add a word, it can basically put attention into that structure. And it could even be if you're using a standard word, because we haven't looked at all the possible combinations. So this is not a strict hard rule, but it's something where we say, these are the things that we like to use. If you want to make your job easy, then you just use one of them. I think it's extremely hard to do that in open source, because there's no standardization body for that. There's one of the things that we do when it comes to error recovery, is that we also have like a thesaurus of these are the words that do different things. And what you can do very nicely in a CLI is you can have hidden functionality. So if someone types in restart instead of reboot, then we can say either, did you mean reboot? Should I now reboot? And in this case, maybe it isn't feasible to actually reboot without asking. But in some cases, you could also take another word and just execute the action that might be relevant. So I think you can be very forgiving in reacting to users' requests. You should be very strict and very clear in providing like the structure that, like, what are the guidance, what actions are available.
Thank you so much for your talk. I think the entire idea of usability in CLIs is really revolutionary and subversive. Not saying like, oh, this is hard to figure out. Like, let's make it easier to figure out. I wanted to ask if you have seen using this process make a tool easier to use for people who are maybe not so familiar with command line interfaces or have never used them before.
I have seen this improve the experience of people who use command line interfaces a lot, but not a specific tool a lot. And this is related to this, I think, a fairly famous example where there's this Unix, the GNU command ln, and I have always no idea what comes first and second as an argument. People like confuse that all of the time, and this is the reason for that is that they don't use it on a daily basis. If all my job would be about linking files, I would not need to know, basically. So I think the biggest impact that we foresee is when you have a tool that you're not using on a constant basis. CLIs, for people who never used CLIs, the way that we think about that is probably not directly, because opening a terminal and then understanding that way of having a dialogue with a machine is not something that people are naturally doing at the moment, but there's all these AI dialogues at the moment that are happening. And if you think of that area and that people are building agents that do things for you on your machine, we do see a very close connection that if you expose functionality through a CLI and a set of actions and a set of objects, that is actually very useful information for an LLM. So if you ask, I don't know, an LLM to download your favorite video from YouTube, that should be something that could do through a CLI. And it would be a lot easier than doing it through your browser.
My question might be a bit strange in the context. I had like a moment when you showed the slide of like the different kinds of words, like the action. It was a little while ago in the slides. Yeah, the objects, actions, and grammar. My question is, do you think that this process of designing a CLI means that it's very difficult to design dark patterns in an interface or in an interaction? Because this seems like a process that would be hard to make like into a dark pattern.
I think what this is about is being extremely transparent. And if you're extremely transparent, I would agree, yes, that's making it very hard to introduce dark patterns, because dark patterns are often about misleading. And I think that there is a trade-off that you have when you're trying to create that experience for not frequent users. What you can do is you can become like more you can create flows, basically, that combine several actions. Because you say when someone's setting up a machine, it always works like this. If someone wants to create a new project, I also have always like to ask these 7 questions. And then you're back into, yes, of course, this can have dark patterns in there. But this is, the thing that you can still do is you can use the sequence of things, the sequence of objects, the sequence of actions to suggest certain things. And what we might want to do is, if you wanted to create, let's say, a VM and then run it, we could basically say, yeah, you can do that without specifying an operating system. Then we run Ubuntu. But you could also put in like an operating system name that you first have to know which one it is, and then you can also start another image. So it's not entirely, I would say, fair, but it's a lot more fair because it gives a lot more responsibility to the user.
The last question, I believe this is like the dark patterns are like, this is what you're doing. You are designing experience and guiding people, and it's really the intentions that matter, not really how exactly you do it. If the intentions are bad, then you have got dark patterns. Yeah, but generally you want to guide people and help them to do stuff. Yeah.
For me, a big part of using a CLI is the composability. I'm not just running one command, but I'm running lots of commands in a pipeline, or I have a little script and all of that. How is that part of what you're doing, thinking about how you can compose those commands that you're designing with other commands that might exist already?
Yeah, I think there's 2 elements of what we do, and one is we should consider, can people also use other commands to do this one thing that I'm adding now? And one case would be like, if I want to, for example, filter what machines, what networks I'm showing. should I make that like a parameter to my tool, or should I just output everything and let people filter through with another tool? And I think that is something that we do on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes we just say the scope of this command is so trivial that people will want to use something else with it. Sometimes we say this is kind of what we do in the UI, and we should have feature parity. So we do the same filtering mechanism also in the CLI. And we use our filter mechanism because we can control it. What we also do is we also require every tool to have a YAML in a JSON output. So what we try to do here is we try to design something for human readability, which means we are sometimes choosing, I would say, directing focus over standard. Like when we're showing like a table, we might want to highlight one line. And that is not exactly what you want to do if you're going through a pipe. So in a pipe, we do not use color. We do not use any special characters. And we also always want to have like a JSON and a YAML output that can then be like put into another tool. But it's a bit of a, I would say, a requirement that is not supported by what I've just said. It's kind of in addition to that, but we are very aware of that.
Thank you very much.